When Claire Thompson stepped off the plane in Ouagadougou, she looked like someone on an important mission. She wore a dusty beige shirt, strong walking boots, and carried a small brown backpack. Her blonde hair was tied neatly, and she smiled politely as local airport staff helped her with directions. Claire said she came from an international health organization. Her mission, she claimed, was to help improve medical care in remote parts of Burkina Faso. People noticed her quickly. Some said she seemed kind. Others said she asked too many questions. She walked through markets, taking photos of old buildings and writing things in a small notebook. She shook hands with villagers and always said, "I'm here to help." When asked what exactly she was doing, she often replied, "I'm learning first, then I'll support." The media liked her. She gave short interviews in French, praising the strength and culture of the people. She said she wanted to build trust before starting her work. Many thought she was different from other foreigners. She didn't drive big cars or stay in expensive hotels. Instead, she stayed in a small guest house, ate local food, and talked to everyone, from school teachers to mechanics. But not everyone was impressed. President Ibrahim Traoré had seen people like Claire before, young, polite, full of promises. Yet somehow their presence always brought more questions than answers. Aid projects would begin and then vanish. New faces would come, and soon after, strange things would happen. He had started watching more carefully, so when Claire arrived, he quietly told his security team to keep an eye on her movements. Not to scare her, but to stay alert. Claire visited villages often. She brought supplies, boxes of medicine, notebooks for children, and sometimes small water filters. People welcomed her. In one village, an old woman said, "She listens more than the others." In another, a man pointed out that she kept walking near old telecom towers, far from the clinics she claimed to help. Some soldiers stationed nearby noticed this too. They reported that she asked about roads leading to military zones. When she was told those places were restricted, she smiled and changed the subject, but she returned to those areas more than once. The strange part was how often she moved. Most aid workers stayed in one village for weeks, building trust and setting up programs. Claire moved every few days. She never stayed long. And wherever she went, people had the same questions. What was she really doing here? The whispers began. Maybe she wasn't just an aid worker. Maybe she was something else. Back in the capital, President Traoré received a short report from his team. It had a list of Claire's recent visits, maps with her travel routes, and a note at the bottom. She's not here for just medicine. Traoré didn't react right away. He looked out the window of his office and said quietly, "Let's find out who she really is." President Ibrahim Traoré sat in his office with a calm face, but his mind was busy. The folder on his desk had details about Claire Thompson, the woman who said she came to help. She was not the first foreign worker to come to Burkina Faso, and she would not be the last. But something about her seemed different. Something felt off. The report from his security team showed that Claire moved often. She visited places most health workers avoided. Instead of staying near clinics or schools, she walked around areas with old communication towers, water tanks, and even near an unused airstrip. It wasn't enough to accuse her of anything, but it was enough to make the president curious. Traoré had been a soldier before he became the country's leader. He had seen how foreign groups operated. Some were honest. Others had secret goals. He had learned to trust actions more than words. Many times, people had entered the country with papers that looked official, speaking about peace and health. Later, they were caught doing something else, gathering information, passing maps, or even spying. So this time, he wanted to be sure. He called his intelligence chief, a careful man named Suleiman. The president said, "Keep watching her. Do not speak to her. Do not stop her. Just observe." Suleiman nodded. He had done this many times before. His team would follow Claire without being seen. They would take photos, write down notes, and listen to any public conversations. That same afternoon, Claire went to a small town near the north. She said she wanted to visit a community health center. Her trip was normal at first, but she made a stop along a dirt road and stood near a tall metal tower. She stayed there for a while, writing in her notebook. She also took pictures. She told a nearby villager that she was interested in the history of communication in the region. Suleiman's team was nearby, hiding in plain sight. They watched quietly and took pictures of their own. One of them said, "She's not just here for health. No health worker does this." Back at the capital, Suleiman prepared a second report. He included new pictures and a map with red circles. He placed the folder on the president's desk the next morning. Traoré looked at it without speaking. He tapped his fingers on the desk, thinking deeply. Then he said, "It's time to meet her." His tone was quiet but firm. He didn't want to create a scene. He didn't want to involve the press. He simply wanted to ask her questions, directly and without warning. This way, he could see how she reacted. People who hide things often show it when they are surprised. He looked at Soleiman and said, "Invite her to the palace. Say we want to thank her for her work." Soleiman nodded again. "Yes, sir." The plan had begun. In a small village 2 hours from Ouagadougou, the sun was setting as Claire Thompson arrived. She stepped out of a dusty pickup truck, smiled at the locals, and waved politely. The village, known for its quiet farms and friendly people, welcomed her as they did with most visitors. She said she had come to check on health needs and speak with the local nurse. She carried a backpack and a camera, just like always. But not everyone was curious about her camera or her notebook. One man, named Mamadou, watched her from under a mango tree. He had seen aid workers before. They usually came in groups and asked about water, food, or sickness. Claire was different. She asked questions that seemed strange. She asked about the old radio tower outside the village. She wanted to know if it still worked. No one had touched it in years. She also asked about a narrow road that led toward the forest, a place people rarely visited. The village children said she spent a long time walking near it, just looking around and taking pictures. Mamadou spoke to his cousin, who worked at a small army checkpoint nearby. His cousin listened carefully, then nodded. "She was near our post last week, too," he said. "She said she was lost, but she wasn't scared. She kept looking at the equipment and asking about the road behind the checkpoint." The two men started connecting the dots. Claire visited several villages, always asking about strange things. Not about sick children. Not about schools. She asked about roads, antennas, and towers. Mamadou's cousin decided to tell this commander. The message moved up the chain quietly, without noise. Soon, a pattern began to form. In another village, a teacher said Claire asked him how often soldiers passed by. In a third, she had asked about water systems that were not even in use anymore. Villagers started talking among themselves. Why does she care about these things? They asked. Who is she really working for? Some thought maybe she was an engineer. Others said she might be a researcher. But more and more people began to wonder if she was something else entirely. Word traveled fast in the countryside. People talked during market days and at the wells. And though no one accused Claire openly, the feeling grew stronger. Something was not right. Meanwhile, Claire continued her visits. She smiled, took notes, handed out supplies, and moved on. But she didn't know that the quiet eyes of the village had started watching her too. Back in Ouagadougou, President Traoré received a call. His officer told him that villagers in 3 different towns had noticed the same strange behavior. The president said nothing at first. Then he simply replied, "Good. Now we know we're not the only ones." His voice was calm, but the message was clear. Claire Thompson was no longer just a visitor. She had become someone worth watching closely. After days of quiet observation, Claire Thompson received an unexpected message. The note arrived at her small guest house in Ouagadougou. It was simple and formal, inviting her to the presidential palace. The letter said that President Ibrahim Traoré wanted to meet her, to thank her for her work in the country and discuss her ongoing projects. Claire was surprised, but she smiled. A meeting with the president was an important opportunity after all. She had worked hard to show the people of Burkina Faso that she cared. Meeting with the president would surely give her the chance to make an even bigger impression. She took a moment to prepare. She dressed carefully in a neat blouse and skirt, choosing a look that was both respectful and professional. Claire had built a reputation for being polite and easy to work with, and she planned to keep it that way during the meeting. She knew how to speak with people in power, how to share just enough to build trust. The drive to the palace was calm. Claire stared out the window, thinking about her work and the people she had met. She had become familiar with the village life, with the faces of the sick, the children, and the farmers. She had helped when she could, handed out medicine, and provided support. Her work had been meaningful, and she felt proud of what she had done. When she arrived at the palace, a soldier greeted her at the entrance. He led her through a quiet courtyard and into a small meeting room. The walls were simple but elegant, and the air was cool. Claire sat in a chair, her hands folded neatly in her lap. She waited. Soon, President Traoré entered. He was dressed in a dark suit, his face calm and serious. He shook her hand briefly and sat down across from her. There was no smile, no small talk, just a quiet, intense atmosphere. "Thank you for coming," the president said, his voice steady. "We've been watching your work closely." Claire nodded, a little nervous. She had expected questions about her projects, her goals, and her progress, but she wasn't prepared for the way the president's eyes studied her. There was something careful about the way he spoke, as if every word was being weighed. "I've heard you've been to several villages," he continued. "What did you find there?" Claire gave her prepared answer. "I found a lot of people in need of basic care. There's still much to do, but we're making progress." The president didn't respond right away. He simply looked at her, as if waiting for more. Claire could feel the silence stretch between them, but she didn't know what else to say. He had asked about her work, and she had answered. "You've been asking about roads, towers, and old infrastructure," Traoré said, his voice still calm. "Why?" Claire's heart skipped a beat. She hadn't expected this. She forced herself to stay composed. "I'm just trying to understand the local needs better," she said carefully. "The infrastructure is important to the people, and I want to see how I can support it." The president didn't nod or show any sign of belief. He simply stared at her, his face unreadable. "I see," he said slowly. "We will keep watching." The meeting ended without much more conversation. Claire left the palace feeling uneasy. She didn't know exactly what President Traoré had meant, but she felt like something was different. She had been invited to the palace, but now she couldn't shake the feeling that she was being watched more closely than she had realized. The following days felt different for Claire Thompson. After her meeting with President Traoré, she noticed a change in the air. It wasn't anything obvious, but there was a feeling that lingered. She couldn't put her finger on it, but something seemed off. She continued her work in the villages, visiting new areas, handing out supplies, and talking to the people. Yet she couldn't shake the feeling that someone was always watching her. One afternoon, Claire received another message. This time, it was an invitation to meet the president again. This time, however, the meeting would be at the presidential palace, not to discuss her work or the country's health needs, but to speak about something else. Claire felt a little uneasy, but she kept her calm. She told herself it was just a formality. Maybe he had some other questions about her projects. The palace was as quiet as it had been the first time. The guards at the entrance barely acknowledged her presence, and the same soldier who had greeted her last time led her through the long hallways. This time, however, the air felt heavier. Claire couldn't tell if it was the silence of the building or the weight of the situation that made her uneasy. When she entered the meeting room, President Traoré was already sitting at the table, looking as calm and focused as ever. His eyes were sharp and his expression unreadable. There were no small talk or pleasantries this time. Claire sat down in front of him, trying to stay composed, though she could feel the tension building. "Thank you for coming again," President Traoré began. His tone was still quiet, but his voice carried authority. "I've been reviewing some of the reports from the villages you visited, and I have some questions for you." Claire's heart beat a little faster. She tried to stay calm, knowing that this was part of the process, part of the job. But something about the way the president was speaking made her nervous. "You've been asking about infrastructure," Traoré continued, "about roads, telecom towers, and water systems. And you've spent a lot of time in areas that are not typical for someone doing health work. Why?" Claire felt her throat dry up. She had expected questions about her projects, her medical work, or even her goals. But this felt different. The president's gaze was intense, focused. He wasn't just asking about her work. He was asking about her true intentions. "I told you before," Claire said, trying to keep her voice steady. "I'm here to help. I'm gathering information to understand what the people really need. The infrastructure is part of that. If we want to help, we have to understand what people need most." President Traoré's eyes didn't leave hers. "Is that the only reason you've been asking about military zones, towers, and roads?" The question hit her like a wave. She wasn't prepared for this direct confrontation. For a moment, Claire felt as if the room had closed in around her. She tried to maintain her composure, but her mind raced. I didn't mean any harm," Claire stammered. "I just wanted to understand the situation here. The health needs of the people are connected to many other things. That's why I've been asking about those areas. They're important for future projects." Traoré leaned forward slightly, his eyes narrowing. "So you say." The silence between them felt heavy. Claire could feel the weight of his words, the pressure mounting. She didn't know how much longer she could keep the conversation going without slipping up. She knew the president had already made up his mind about her, but how much did he really know? "You're free to go for now," Traoré said, finally breaking the silence. "But remember, we'll be watching. Be careful with who you trust." Claire stood up, unsure of what to say. She nodded and walked toward the door, feeling a cold chill run down her spine. She had been summoned, questioned, and left with more questions of her own. As she left the palace, she couldn't shake the feeling that she was trapped in something much larger than she had expected. After Claire Thompson left the presidential palace, she tried to shake off the unsettling feeling that had followed her from the meeting. Her mind raced with thoughts and questions. Had she said something wrong? What did President Traoré mean by "be careful with who you trust"? She couldn't help but feel as though something bigger was happening behind the scenes, something she couldn't yet see. Over the next few days, Claire continued her work in the villages, but there was a new awareness in her actions. She became more cautious, watching the people around her with suspicion. She had once trusted everyone, believing in the goodness of her mission, but now she wasn't so sure. The president's words echoed in her mind, and she wondered if her every move was being watched. She couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't right. Meanwhile, President Traoré wasn't resting either. He had received more reports about Claire's activities from his intelligence network. His team had been quietly following her for weeks, and the pattern of her movements became clearer with each passing day. She wasn't just visiting villages. She was spending time near places that were connected to old military routes and communications networks, areas that were far from the usual focus of an aid worker. Soleiman, the intelligence chief, had been quietly gathering information from locals, even from the soldiers at the checkpoints. There were rumors. In the small towns where Claire had visited, people whispered about her behavior. They spoke of her asking strange questions about military zones, about roads that led to old camps, and towers that were no longer in use. Some even said they had seen her near locations that were highly restricted. The president studied the reports carefully. He couldn't ignore the signs any longer. Claire was not just an aid worker. There was something else going on. He couldn't risk allowing someone with unclear intentions to operate in the country. Not when tensions were high and security was fragile. He made a decision. It was time to get to the bottom of things. Traoré called a meeting with his closest advisors. Soleiman laid out the findings, showing maps with red marks where Claire had visited. There were areas that had been off-limits to most people, yet Claire had spent hours there, often without any clear explanation. The reports didn't lie. Something was off, and it wasn't just a misunderstanding. "We need to act carefully," Traoré said, his voice steady but firm. "We don't want to make her suspicious, but we also need to find out exactly what she's doing here." The plan was simple. They would continue to monitor her, but they would also try to gather more direct evidence. They would place more undercover operatives in the villages, watching Claire from the shadows. It was a delicate operation, and President Traoré knew that any mistake could lead to disaster. As the days passed, Claire continued her travels. She didn't notice the extra eyes on her. She went about her business, unaware that the quiet investigation into her activities was growing deeper. But each time she asked about a restricted area or took a picture of a military zone, it only added to the mounting suspicions. Claire was about to find out just how much attention she had drawn, and how quickly the president's patience was running out. The days grew longer, and Claire Thompson continued her work, but the quiet feeling of unease never left her. She had visited more villages, handed out supplies, and talked to the people, but each time her mind would wander back to that meeting with President Traoré. His words, though polite, had been sharp. "Be careful with who you trust." She didn't know why, but she felt like she was being watched. She couldn't trust the feeling, but she couldn't ignore it either. One afternoon, Claire decided to visit a village near a large communications tower. It wasn't one of the locations she had visited before, but it seemed like a good place to gather more information. She hoped to meet with the local nurse and learn more about the healthcare situation there. The nurse had been busy with other patients, so Claire spent time walking around, taking notes, and speaking with a few villagers. But as Claire walked around the area, she couldn't help but notice the presence of two men who were watching her. They stood by the edge of the village, near the road that led toward the abandoned military base. Claire couldn't see them clearly, but she felt their eyes on her. It wasn't just the way they looked at her. It was the way they seemed to be waiting for her to do something. She shook off the feeling and continued her work, but the suspicion lingered. As Claire left the village that afternoon, she was careful to stay on the main roads. She didn't want to take any chances. She had been careful to stay away from restricted areas, but the memory of the two men still bothered her. Were they just villagers, or had they been watching her for a reason? Meanwhile, President Traoré's team was closing in. Soleiman, the intelligence chief, had been receiving reports about Claire's activities every day. There was no clear evidence yet, but the pattern was undeniable. Claire had been moving closer and closer to the areas that were most sensitive. She had spent time near military bases and old army posts. She had asked too many questions about roads, towers, and communications equipment, things that had no connection to her supposed mission. The president decided it was time to take more direct action. He had been patient up to this point, but he couldn't afford to wait any longer. Claire's movements were no longer a coincidence. Someone had to confront her and find out exactly what she was up to. Traoré knew he couldn't let her continue operating without understanding her true intentions. That evening, Soleiman prepared a team for a more direct approach. They would follow Claire's movements, carefully and quietly, but they would also take action if necessary. It was a delicate task. The last thing the president wanted was to make a mistake and cause panic. But he had made up his mind. Claire Thompson's presence in Burkina Faso was no longer something he could ignore. As Claire prepared for another trip, unaware of the shadow that was growing closer, she couldn't shake the feeling that something was about to change. She wasn't sure what it would be, but she knew one thing for sure. She wasn't just a visitor anymore. She was a target. The next morning, Claire Thompson was ready for another day of work. She had planned to visit a small village on the outskirts of the city, a place where she hadn't been before. She packed her bag with medical supplies and mats, just as she had done countless times before. The sun was already high in the sky as she climbed into her car and drove down the winding dirt roads. But as Claire made her way through the countryside, she noticed something strange. A vehicle had been following her for the past hour. At first, she thought it might be a coincidence, but as the road turned, the vehicle stayed behind her, always at a distance. Claire's instincts told her something was wrong. She tried to shake off the feeling, but the unease only grew stronger. She decided to take a detour, hoping to lose the car behind her. She took a sharp turn off the main road, heading toward an area she hadn't planned to visit. The vehicle followed. Claire's heart began to race. She couldn't be sure who was behind the wheel, but the thought of being followed made her feel exposed. She took another turn, hoping to find a place to stop and think, but the vehicle continued to follow, keeping the same distance. Finally, Claire pulled over at a small rest area by the side of the road. She sat in the car for a few minutes, trying to decide what to do next. The car following her stopped as well, a few meters behind. Claire could see the shadow of a man inside. She knew she had to face whatever was happening head-on. As she stepped out of the car, she saw the vehicle's door open. Two men stepped out, both wearing dark uniforms. They looked like soldiers, but Claire couldn't be sure. They approached her slowly, their steps measured. "We need to talk," one of the men said in a calm but firm voice. Claire's stomach tightened. She had known this moment would come. She had been careful, but it hadn't been enough. The president's warning echoed in her mind. "Be careful with who you trust." "Who are you?" Claire asked, trying to keep her voice steady. "We are working with the government," the second man replied. "You've been asking too many questions. Too many questions about things that don't concern you." Claire took a step back, her mind racing. She had no choice but to face them now. The truth was coming out, and there was no way to hide. "I'm just doing my work," she said, trying to sound calm. "I'm helping people, that's all." The two men exchanged a glance. "We know who you are," one of them said, "and we know what you've been doing. You've been looking into things that are dangerous, things that you shouldn't be touching." Claire's heart sank. She had always suspected that her work wasn't as simple as it seemed, but she never expected it to come to this. She didn't know who she could trust anymore. The men had made it clear. Her actions had caught their attention, and now there would be consequences. "You're coming with us," one of the men said. Claire knew there was no point in resisting. She was caught, and her cover had been blown. She followed the men, her thoughts spinning with the realization that everything had changed. Her mission, once so clear, was now tangled in a web of suspicion and danger. As they led her to their vehicle, Claire realized she would never be the same. The truth about her presence in Burkina Faso was about to be revealed, and there was no turning back.